Welcome to our briefing today. My name is Ali Safavi, and I'm a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, which is a democratic coalition of Iranian political personalities and organizations dedicated to the overthrow of the Iranian regime and the establishment of a democratic, secular, and a non-nuclear republic in Iran. As you are already aware, on Friday, Ebrahim Raisi was installed as the next president of the Iranian regime. This development was, of course, met with international outrage, not least because someone whom the Iranian people have dubbed as the henchman of 1988 massacre was propelled to presidency in a process that was neither fair nor free. It was, in one word, a travesty. But because he was a member of a death commission in Tehran, and that death commission, along with similar commissions across Iran, sent 30,000 political prisoners, mostly members of the Iranian Mujahedin-e-Khalq, the MEK, to the gallows after kangaroo trials that lasted for a few minutes. One other related development, of course, regarding the election was the nationwide boycott on the call of the MEK by the overwhelming majority of the Iranian people. Reports compiled by more than 1,200 observers from 400 cities across Iran and 3,500 video clips confirmed that less than 10% of the eligible voters cast their ballots, making it clear that the Iranian people want nothing less than the overthrow of this regime. Khamenei, of course, out of desperation and faced with an exploding society, engineered the ascension of someone who is described as one of the worst criminals and murderers in modern times. He is in reality the poster child of the religious tyranny that rules Iran today. Raisi's ascension also, I think, put an end to the fallacious moderate versus hardliner narrative which the Iranian people had already debunked in their chants of hardliner reformer. The game is now over in the course of 4 major nationwide uprisings since 2017. I am delighted that we are joined today by a distinguished panel to discuss this very important and urgent matter with a particular focus on the culture of impunity exercised by the international community vis-a-vis the murderous tyranny ruling Iran. Our briefing is broadcast live on our Twitter feed at Iran Policy, and we will have 2 question and answer periods during this briefing. Before I ask our speakers to take the podium, however, let us watch a very short video clip about Ebrahim Raisi, the henchman of the 1988 massacre, and then I will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Get to know Ebrahim Raisi, a candidate in the Iranian regime's sham presidential election and the main executioner in the 1988 massacre. Raisi was born in Mashhad, northeast Iran, back in 1960. He went to school for 6 years, then entered the Mashhad religious school. At the age of 15, he went to Qom, continuing his studies in the Haghani school alongside other known regime criminals such as Ali Khamenei, Ruhollah Hosseinian, Mustafapour Mohammadi, and Hossein Ali Nairi. He was 18 during the 1979 revolution and had no political experience. At the age of 19, he was officially selected to supervise the interrogation and torture of prisoners in Karaj, west of Tehran. He was appointed as public prosecutor of Karaj and Hamadan at the age of 20. He went on to become the deputy public prosecutor in Tehran, and in 1988 he was an active member of the Deaths Commission, overseeing the massacre of political prisoners in Evan and Gohar Tasht prisons.
یکی از ایراداتی که با آقای رئیسی میگرفتن این بود که آقای رئیسی مثلا جزء این گروهی بوده که اعدام شده. خب آقای رئیسی رو باید جایزه داد.
And this is Ebrahim Raisi's reward, a poorly educated mullah who reached the realms of power by massacring political prisoners. Public prosecutor of Tehran for 5 years. Head of the country's inspections office for 10 years. General prosecutor for 2 years. Deputy judiciary chief for 10 years. head of the Istan Quds Razavi Foundation, meaning Iran's largest economic entity. And finally, head of the regime's judiciary.
کوچکترین اغماضی در هیچ مرحله نسبت به افراد ضد انقلابی که چه دستگیر شدن و چه بعد از این دستگیر بشن نخواهد شد و ما با قاطعیت نسبت به اینها برخورد.
This ruthless criminal was Khamenei's candidate in the 2017 presidential election. However, he lost due to the revelations made by the Iranian opposition National Council of Resistance of Iran. This criminal mullah has entered the 2021 presidential election to relieve Khamenei of the many crises engulfing his regime. However, this time around he will once again be condemned by the people and his victims' families.
Thank you very much for that video. As I said in the beginning, we are joined by a distinguished panel today. Let me introduce them in the order that they will speak. Our first speaker is Mr. Jeffrey Robertson, QC, a human rights barrister, academic, and author. Mr. Robertson was a UN appeals judge and president of the War Crimes Court in Sierra Leone from 2002 to 2007. He conducted a thorough investigation in the 1988 massacre and authored the book Mullahs Without Mercy based on his investigations. He has been on several human rights missions on behalf of Amnesty International. Our next speaker is Mr. Nick Fluck, a distinguished high street solicitor and the president emeritus of the Law Society of England and Wales, in which he has been a member for 16 years. We also have with us Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield Jr., Chairman Emeritus at the Stimson Center. He served as a national security official in the administrations of President Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, and George W. Bush, and appointed as a special envoy for Manpad's threat reduction. Mr. Bloomfield was a former Assistant Secretary of State and Defense as well. Our next speaker is Mr. Tahir Boumedra, an international human rights lawyer and coordinator of justice for the victims of the 1988 massacre of political prisoners in Iran, JVMI. He was a former regional director at Penal Reform International and a former chief of the United Nations Human Rights Office in Iraq, and advisor to the special representative of the UN Secretary General. And finally, we have with us Mr. Reza Fallahi, a former political prisoner in Iran who survived miraculously the 1988 massacre, and he resides in London. With that, Mr. Robertson, the floor is yours. Could you please unmute yourself?
Thank you and good afternoon. We now have an international criminal as president of the state of Iran. He's guilty of crimes against humanity committed in late 1988 by the slaughter of thousands of prisoners in two waves. And it's important to remember this. The first wave were those of Mujahedin support, who had mainly been imprisoned in the early 80s. Most of them had actually completed their sentence, and they were executed without pity. The second wave was of theocratic dissidents, communists, atheists, left-wingers. They were executed for being Muharib, in other words, opposed to the theocratic state of the Ayatollah Khamenei. So there we have, in outset, a crime against humanity. It's been contrary to law for hundreds of years to kill prisoners and to kill them without trial. But the background to this crime is, of course, the war between Iran and Iraq, a war that one Dr. Kissinger hoped that both sides would lose. But it had 1 million casualties by 1988 when a truce was arranged. Signing it, said the Ayatollah, was like drinking poison. And in revenge and in rage, he issued a fatwa that all those who were in prison, no matter for how long, who had remained Moharib, contrary to his theocracy, must die. And that was carried out by a death committee in which Ebrahim Raisi was a central figure. Now, some years ago, I was asked by the Borman Foundation in Washington to investigate, and it was, I think, the first investigation of the 1988 massacres. I read all the papers, the Kayan and other papers at the time. I interviewed about 50 survivors of this period in prison. And here was my conclusion. I'll read it, if I may. Late in July 1988, as the war with Iraq was ending in a truculent truce, prisons in Iran, crammed with government opponents, suddenly went into lockdown. All family visits were cancelled, television and radio switched off. Prisoners were kept in their cells. The only permitted visitation was from a delegation, turbaned and bearded, which came in black government BMWs to outlying jails. A religious judge, a public prosecutor, and an intelligence chief. Before them were paraded, briefly and individually, almost every prisoner, and there were thousands of them, who had been jailed in the early 1980s for adherence to the MEK, the Mujahedin-e-Khalq organization, and then in the second wave, those who were suspected of being communists or left-wingers or Muharrab. The death committee had but one question for these young men and women, most of them detained merely for taking part in demonstrations in the early 80s. And although they didn't know it, on their answer, their life would depend. Those who by that answer evinced any continuing affiliation with the MEK or with atheism were blindfolded and ordered to join a conga line that led straight to the gallows. They were hung from cranes 4 at a time, or in groups of 6 from ropes hanging from the stage of the prison assembly hall. Some were taken to army barracks at night, directed to make their wills, and then shot by firing squad. Their bodies were doused with disinfectant, packed in refrigerated trucks, and buried by night in mass graves. Months later, their families, desperate for information about their children, would be handed a plastic bag with their few possessions. They would be refused any information about the location of the graves and ordered never to mourn them in public. By mid-August 1988, thousands of prisoners had been killed in this manner by the state, without trial, without appeal, and utterly without mercy. And that followed in late August and September with the second wave of killing of those atheists. So, because they were apostates in the view of the government. So that was my conclusion, that this was indeed one of the greatest crimes against humanity, certainly the greatest committed against prisoners since the death marches at the end of the Second World War ordered by the Japanese authorities. So that is the outlet. The chairman described the courts as kangaroo courts. That's a phrase I never use because I'm an Australian. I don't know what our beloved marsupial has done to be connected with injustice, but these courts were not courts at all. They were committees that directed people to the gallows, and Raisi was a central figure. He was always, or mostly, the prosecution representative. He had been a prosecutor since 19. He was only 28 by the time his zeal had appointed him to the deputy prosecutor of Tehran. So it was really not a court at all. It was simply a body that directed people to the gallows or not if they were prepared to renounce their oppositionism and be complicit in activities against the oppositionists. Now, Raisi's guilt is not only a matter of public record. He's admitted that he was a member of the death committee, but it looms large in the diary of the number 2 Ayatollah at the time, a man named Montazeri, who was expected to be Khamenei's successor. Khamenei was actually dying of cancer at the time. And Montazeri decided that this was wrong, that this would not sit well with posterity. And he called up 4 members of the death committee, including Raisi, and told them, you've got to stop the executions. And they said, we've already executed 1,300 in even prison. We've only got 200 to go, and we're under orders, a fatwa of the Ayatollah. So they refused. Montazeri, who had shown some degree of compassion, was sidelined. He was put under house arrest, and he lost his position as the successor to Ayatollah Khamenei. So what do we assess these matters now? Quite plainly, the mass murder of prisoners, whether they were oppositionists or atheists, is a crime against humanity. And I've set out in my book the crimes that have been committed, including, it may be, genocide, because in the second wave, those individuals were sent to death because they didn't believe in the state religion. And that strikes me as a form of genocide. The penalty was slightly different. In the first round of MEK killings, men and women were both killed without exception. In the second wave, the men were killed, the women were not. They were not initially. They were whipped 5 times a day until they repented or until they died from the whipping. So on any view, this was a most barbaric, unlawful exercise of state power. So at least you can say that the election, and of course it was flawed in many ways, of President Raisi focuses attention on this barbaric moment in world history that has been overlooked. The United Nations has, I think, a bad conscience over this, because at the time, Amnesty International, the rapporteur for Iran, alerted it to what was happening, to these mass graves in Tehran and throughout Iran, and it did nothing. It turned a blind eye. The representative of Iran at the United Nations lied through his teeth, pretending that the only people killed had been those involved in the war. So the rapporteur for Iran was a very naive El Salvador diplomat who didn't actually pursue the allegations for a couple of years, and then he was invited to even prison. They welcomed him with a brass band, rather as the Nazis would welcome observers to the concentration camps. A number of actors were paraded pretending to be prisoners and saying what wonderful food they were receiving. He did ask to see Ayatollah Montazeri, but that request was refused, and so he didn't follow up. The UN has a duty, seems to me, to set up a proper inquiry into these barbaric doings of 1988. There will be further material emerging, I think, from the trial in Sweden, which begins in August, of Hamid Nouri, who was a clerk to the death committee in Tehran prisons, and he ventured to Sweden ill-advisedly and was recognized and arrested. And he'll be put on trial for a crime against humanity. It may be that his testimony, certainly the testimony of other witnesses, will identify the role played by the president of Iran in this international crime. Well, the United Nations will have to grapple with the fact that one of its members is led by an international criminal. It may do that, as it did with Gaddafi. It put up with Gaddafi's sermons at the time that he was guilty of international terrorism, but it is likely that given the evidence against Raisi, the US may refuse to allow him to be present at UN summits. In any event, diplomats will have to be careful. They will never shake the blood-stained hand of this criminal or bump his shoulder or take anything he says seriously. His presence in any international forum will damage that forum. And so it does pose a problem which I think should first be addressed by the United Nations, going back and examining the events of 1988, the lies that were told by Iran's representative at the time, and the role of President Raisi in what is undoubtedly one of the worst crimes against humanity committed since the war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robertson, for that tremendous presentation, your vivid depiction of the horror that went on in Evin and Gohardasht prison, and of course on the need for the international community to finally end the culture of impunity and bring these murderers to justice. I think the families of the victims, but more importantly, the conscience of humanity needs redress for this crime. And now it is my pleasure to present Mr. Khalq. As I said, he is the President Emeritus of the Law Society of England and Wales. Mr. Khalq, please go ahead with your remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Safavi. Interesting to hear from Jeffrey Robertson, who is a very great authority on these matters. I said in prior discussions that I'm not a great authority on the internal politics of Iran, but I do understand and am keen to promote in every country that we have dealings with the rule of law. The rule of law is always a difficult thing for people to understand, but fundamentally in this case, we have a situation where reports in the press in the West say that when he was in a press conference, he said he was proud of his record when he was asked about the massacre, about the death committees and so on. And that really serves, I think, as an important wake-up call to us, that we can't just sit silent on the sidelines. Silence and inaction doesn't produce change. And in this case, it's pretty clear that change is radically needed. I also understand that there's a legal move afoot to involve the Metropolitan Police in investigating evidence of the crimes that Ebrahim Raisi is believed to have committed here in the United Kingdom. The jurisdiction for dealing with these sorts of crimes is an international one, where crimes against international law and against human rights law. So there would be no necessary impediment to being able to do that. I understand that, as Jeffrey says, this is a leader who will be widely, I hope, shunned. There will be a lack of credibility about anything that he may say. I do know, as I've done a quick swoop through the Western press about this man to see if I could glean some more facts about him. I do know that when he announced his candidacy for the 2021 presidential election, he said that he'd come as an independent to the stage to make changes in the executive management of the country and to fight poverty, corruption, humiliation, and discrimination. I think the difficult thing is, how do you square that with the past history that is known and published about Ebrahim Raisi? He cannot really be a champion against corruption when, at least initially, there have been plenty of reports about alternative candidates that would have stood against him, finding themselves disqualified. I think it's interesting that dissidents and reformists urged voters to boycott the poll. That's perhaps why, although he inevitably won the election, he did so with a very low turnout compared to even the turnout of his predecessor. I think the difficulty I have as a lawyer is to look at things like the past record. So can you say we can take a prisoner already convicted of a crime against the state and then magically retry them and impose a death penalty? These are people who are already in the custody of the state, who've been convicted, rightly or wrongly, of crimes against the state, and the state unilaterally decides to up the ante. There is a huge legal problem with that. There's some very old, in my jurisdiction, we have a lot of law French and law Latin wordings, but there are words such as autrefois convict, so you can't be tried again for something you've already been convicted of. In this case, it appears that the death committees were simply performing a cleaning up operation to remove those people who were vociferous against the regime. It does appear, from what I've heard and read, that people who were faced with these, and apologies to Jeffrey's national heritage kangaroo courts, were effectively given an option to recant. I'm not sure that can ever be an appropriate procedure. Purely from a legal point of view, how can it possibly be an appropriate procedure to give somebody who is already a prisoner and in custody of the state an opportunity to change their position against the alternate threat of death? That can never be right. Now, I hope that it's not that record that Mr. Raisi was claiming to be proud of. He has, I understand, reduced the number of people sentenced to death in Iran. Sadly, my understanding of the current statistics is that Iran is still the second highest numbers of people put to death by the state, second only to China. I think there's a difficulty with this process because we are asked to consider, and certainly Amnesty International have been very vociferous in saying, there is effectively a position which is unassailable. Somebody who is both a churchman, a statesman, a judge, funded by the state, a member of the ruling elite club, is very hard to dislodge. And given the control of the media, it's almost impossible to make any of the various allegations which are notably swirling around this gentleman stick. Certainly, it's impossible to make them stick inside Iran. Now, I applaud the efforts and the diligence and the persuasiveness of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. I know that there is massive concern about what's happening in this regime. The difficulty is that we are all sitting outside the regime. And it's very easy, certainly for me as a lawyer, to look on dispassionately and say that just can't be. It is inappropriate. It's the wrong approach in law. It's the wrong approach in democracy. We'd like to see a secular, responsible state controlled by, operated for the people. And the difficulty is that however many times we say that, a closed regime with an idée fixe about its own sanctity and about its own powers, and with control over the media, it's almost impossible to do anything to dislodge that, otherwise than by the sort of action that Jeffrey Robertson is recommending. I would be very delighted to see that Mr. Raisi, who I think is his full name, I think is Saeed Ebrahim Raisi. I would really like to see that he would have to answer in an international forum run by rule of law standards for his past actions and his dedication to a unilateral, monolithic state that admits of no wrongdoing, and that absolutely does not appear to have any cause or motivation to change what it is doing, despite, as I say, the second highest judicial death toll in the world. This is an appalling state, and it needs to allow the modernization that he himself suggested he would bring in his new role. It needs to be giving some effect to his promises to fight poverty and, most of all, corruption and discrimination. And I look forward to seeing how this develops in the next few months. And I know that the National Council of Resistance of Iran will make this an enormous focus for its activities and its very hard work, based upon nothing else other than the protection of the citizens of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Locke, for that those incisive remarks. Mindful that, of course, the Iranian regime judiciary is probably the most corrupt institution in Iran, and nobody buys Raisi's claims that he has fought corruption seriously. And of course, in the 2 years since he's been at the helm of the judiciary, more than 600 people have been sent to the gallows in unfair trials contrary to the due process of law. At this time, I give the podium to Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield Jr. Mr. Bloomfield, please unmute and the floor is yours. And after Mr. Bloomfield is finished, we will pause and allow journalists to ask a few questions, and then we will continue after the question and answer period. Please, Mr. Bloomfield.
Thank you very much, Ali, and greetings to everyone in whichever time zone you are sitting. It is an honor for me to join this podium, first of all, with Ali Safavi, who has helped me to have access to people to answer my questions about the long and difficult history of this regime. I've learned a lot. I'm honored by all of the panelists, but I want to say a special word for George Robertson, whose report was so instructive and for me opened my eyes to the 1988 massacre, so that the information that we have learned since then has made perfect sense. Also, Mr. Tahar Boumedra, from whom you will hear, has literally counted the bodies of Iran resistance members who were unlawfully assassinated by the Iranian regime. These were unarmed people, and Tahar is a very distinguished former United Nations human rights official. I will speak directly to the questions that interest me, which is, what issues does the Raisi presidency raise for the international community and for the United States? What do you do about dealing with a gross violator of human rights who should be on trial at The Hague and convicted? And I'm not a lawyer, so that makes my perspective different. What policy should governments follow now that there is no prospect of a rapprochement, a warming of relations for the United States with Iran, something that was spoken about at the United Nations by President Obama at the time of the nuclear negotiations. What should the future be for Iran as a state among the international community with important relations around the world, a country of 80 million people? What issues does the Raisi presidency put before the world? And my message to all of you is that these are not new questions. These questions have actually been relevant for years, but the West, and I speak about my own country, has failed to face the reality. Will they face the reality now? Let us be clear. The founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khamenei, and his successor, the current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, are both gross violators of human rights. They are responsible for directing major acts of international terrorism on foreign soil. And so if you go back to what was mentioned by Jeffrey Robertson, Ayatollah Montazeri, yes, he spoke to the death panels, but he also corresponded with Ayatollah Khamenei. Why did he do this? Because Khamenei was the one who directed the massacre. He was the most responsible figure, the supreme leader of Iran. And what have we seen now over 43 years since the revolution? We saw Khomeini, who invented essentially velayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurists, the dictatorship based on religious faith, but translated into political and temporal power. He then handed his job to Ali Khamenei, who did not have superior religious credentials. His distinction was that he was reliable and he understood how to keep the regime in power against great dissension from many people in the population. And now Raisi, who is even more reliable. He has been the one using the judiciary to suppress the will of the Iranian people for his entire career. Yes, 30,000 people were put to death very quickly in the mid and late 1988. But let's look at the protests in Iran since 2017. What has been really happening under President Rouhani, the moderate, the reformist? Well, Ebrahim Raisi and others have been putting protesters in jail and executing them for their beliefs. In other words, the massacre of 1988 and Raisi's role in the massacre has continued, perhaps not at the same pace, but it has been going on right before our eyes in recent years and goes on even today. So this regime appears to be trying to hang on to power even at the expense of legitimacy. And I must say, for the benefit of the press, every time they report the turnout in the presidential election and the turnout in previous elections, please be careful. The timing at the polls was extended at the last minute for several hours. You have to ask yourself, is this a credible story? Did the Interior Ministry give honest numbers at any time about the turnout? I think you should be very careful and not be naive about this. Let's look at what Iran has been doing, even under Rouhani. They were staging a terrorist bombing that could have caused mass casualties in France, even before President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. Iran's Revolutionary Guards were caught trafficking in heroin, driving trucks through Europe. They were caught shipping massive arms to non-state militias in Lebanon and Yemen and elsewhere. And so all of these things and more have been occurring under the so-called reformists. Now, the Iran watchers in Washington are now very confused because they see that possibly Raisi's election will lead very quickly to the restoration of the nuclear agreement. How is this possible under this ultra hardliner? Well, it just goes to show that the West is thoroughly confused, and I include some of the media in this. They have been living under an illusion. So now you see a relatively young apparatchik who is taking the presidency. He's on the way to becoming the next supreme leader. The entire logic of this is regime survival. He has a long history of ruthless brutality working in the judiciary, but he also was in charge of the largest religious foundation. So not only does he understand how to keep dissidents under lock and key, but he also knows where the supreme leader's money is. It's considerable money, tens of billions of dollars, which is not in the government budget. So this is a man who is there simply to perpetuate a dictatorial religious regime. He will never change the constitution and undo this terrible historic mistake of combining religious and political power. And the rest, the Western media has been reduced to reporting that this is a change, that this is an ultra-conservative new president, that he is a war criminal. Well, yes, but where on the ballot was there an alternative option? Where could the Iranian people have voted for a way to end arbitrary justice and executions, to end terror operations abroad, to end corruption and mismanagement, which is terrible. The coronavirus response, the environmental disaster, and many other aspects are mismanaged terribly inside Iran. And to end these expensive campaigns to destabilize the Sunni Arab world in the neighborhood, and to pursue normal political relations and trade relations with Europe, North America, Japan, South Korea. None of these were possible in this election or in the previous elections. So we have two questions. One, what should the world do about the presidency of Ebrahim Raisi? And I defer to our international legal scholars on the immediate next steps. But there's a bigger question that is posed here as we now understand what has been happening. What do we do about a hostile, untrustworthy, and destructive Islamic Republic of Iran? I believe you'll hear a lot more about this in July. I believe it's July 10th, Ali, when the National Council of Resistance holds its annual summit. There will be many views on what to do about Iran. But mark my words, it's not just about Raisi. His election has only clarified the negative trend that we have been seeing. And I can honestly say that here in Washington, my colleagues have spent far too long avoiding the bigger question. I suspect they won't be able to avoid it much longer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bloomfield, for your excellent remarks, particularly raising the issue that Raisi and the 1988 massacre needs to be addressed in the context of policy vis-a-vis Iran. That is absolutely correct. I think, if anything, what happened in Iran this past Friday vindicated what the Iranian resistance had been saying all along in the past 4 decades, that a viper never gives birth to a dove. And I think it is time for the international community to wake up to that reality. And I'm glad that you mentioned the July event. Yes, there will be a 3-day event, July 10 to 12, where in addition to tens of thousands of Iranians from across the world, we will have close to 1,000 dignitaries, lawmakers, prime ministers, foreign ministers, ministers, human rights advocates who will join on an online conference addressing, among other things, of course, the 1988 massacre and policy toward Iran. With that said, I now turn the floor to some of our journalists who've joined us to ask questions, and then we will resume with Mr. Boumedra and Mr. Fallahi. Please, if there are any questions, please raise your hand and state your question. Are there any questions from the journalists? Please state your media as well.
Mr. Safavi, perhaps I could say a few words. It's Nick Fluck again.
Please, Mr. Fluck, go ahead.
I'm really just filling a gap at the moment. I think that the press are waiting to ask questions, and I know that I'm probably the least qualified person here to answer those questions fully. But I did just want to remind people that of Raisi's remarks in the press conference just a few days ago, saying he's proud of his record when he was asked about the massacre. That's another reminder to us that silence and inaction is not the answer. We absolutely must change things. We must act. So I understand the impetus is, from the point of view of the law, is to invite the Metropolitan Police to investigate evidence of the crimes which are subject to universal jurisdiction, with a view to Mr. Raisi being prosecuted in the United Kingdom. I know I've said that before, but it's a very important point, and I think we need to focus on that. Certainly, as a lawyer, you would expect my position to be that we focus on legal solutions to things. And that's very crucial, because the only way that we can motivate the international community to understand the position in Iran is by letting them view that through the tools, through the lens of external scrutiny and external legal appropriate behavior. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that comment, Mr. Fluck. Indeed, the families of the victims of the 1988 massacre, I understand, are filing a lawsuit. They're going to be filing a lawsuit against Raisi tomorrow in London, and the Metropolitan Police has been informed. And of course, we very much look forward to that process. I'm told that the National Council of Representatives of Iran is also initiating other legal action against Raisi in other countries of the world, because as all of you have said already, we cannot let this criminal get away with what he has done in the past. And we have to ensure that the international community does react and bring the criminals who rule Iran to justice. Again, if there are any questions, please.
Yeah, I have a question. Paul Peachy here from the National Newspaper of the Middle East.
Please go ahead, Paul.
A couple of things, if I may. Firstly, for Mr. Robertson, you have only passing reference to Mr. Raisi in your report for the foundation. Can you, from your interviews with these 50 survivors, what the most egregious behaviour that you learned of directly involving Mr. Raisi? And secondly, could you just, for whoever's most relevant, could you just expand upon this legal action that you're proposing to push tomorrow in London, please?
Mr. Robertson. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, I've unmuted myself. Raisi looms larger in my book, Mullahs Without Mercy, which expands on my report, particularly his role as one of the 4 death committee members summoned by Ayatollah Montazeri, who insisted against his protestations that they were going to continue the executions. I think there have been allegations, which I can't say one way or the other, that he was actually supervising torture sessions. There was an allegation I read the other day that he was involved in pushing people over cliffs. I have no evidence of that. What I have evidence of is that this man, with 2 other colleagues, on numerous occasions sent people to their deaths without a proper or indeed any trial process. And that involves him in a crime against humanity. He is an international criminal, and if ever he ventures out of Iran, any democratic country would be entitled under its law, with universal jurisdiction, as we call it, to arrest him and put him on trial. Therefore, I suspect he will not venture out of Iran, but that is something that will happen to him if he does. I don't know about the proposed legal actions. All I would say is this. In my experience in developing international law, what we must be careful of is raising expectations of the law too high. I think of those demonstrators in Syria in 2011 shouting placards, Assad to the Hague. And then they were machine gunned, and Assad has never gone, as he should, to the Hague. So I would be careful. Law doesn't permit regime change. Law may, and this may be a way, find its way through state immunity doctrines. I think crimes against humanity trump state immunity, and it may be possible to get compensation eventually from Iran for the killings, for the grief, for the suffering that was caused to relatives of victims back in 1988. But that is a different and difficult matter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robertson. Paul, to your second question, our lawyers are working on the indictment against Raisi, and after the indictment is filed, we will certainly provide you with further information on the details. Could we have, if there are other questions, please go ahead and raise your question.
Hi, this is Benjamin Hall, Fox News. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, Ben, we're hearing you. Go ahead.
Hi, I suppose it's a question to everyone, really. What do you think the realistic possibility is of a domestic uprising being able to overthrow the regime at any point? We know what control the IRGC and other bodies have over the people. I mean, is there a genuine possibility that that can happen? And in turn, what sort of external pressure could be put on the regime to perhaps make that happen? I mean, are you looking to the new US administration? What kind of extra support do you think they could give?
Maybe Ambassador Bloomfield, you would like to tackle that since you are sitting in Washington, both questions?
I'd like to make a comment, recognizing that I'm not an expert on events among the Iranian population, so I don't want to disappoint you with that. I do listen to a lot of the dialogue in the think tank community on a regular daily basis, and there is new reference to the fragility and the brittleness of the Iran regime now that it is entirely under the control of the so-called ultra hardline faction. There is a recognition that people in Iran are not simply economically disadvantaged, but their views are very alienated from the regime. There's a great deal of unhappiness, which they now fear could lead to a breaking point. The Iran watchers in Washington that I have heard do not welcome this possibility. They say that we shouldn't expect that the Persian culture will be more civilized than what happened in Libya or Syria, although those are not comparable. Assad is still there, as you just heard from Mr. Khlalq. There hasn't been an overthrow. And the Syrian opposition is actually has a very strong democratic aspiration and agenda. So there is new talk of this. I think it's on the table. The second question, what can be done? I've written an extensive piece suggesting that the United States and perhaps others pursue human rights cases, not only against Raisi, but against everyone in the regime who authorized the bombings in Argentina, the mass machine gunning in Berlin, the assassinations of the translators for Salman Rushdie in several capitals around the world, the murders of former prime ministers. There's a long list of crimes which were probably authorized directly by people sitting at the top of the regime, not to mention the Ministry of Intelligence, which has run into trouble with at least 7 countries in Europe in the last 3 years. So there's much that can be done there. And I think that there should also be a counterintelligence investigation in America to make sure that people who are speaking on behalf of Iran are identified for their connection to the regime. There have been arrests already this year of people who were being paid by the regime, but were pretending to be independent Iranian exiles offering their own views. These and other steps should be pursued to put pressure on the regime, regardless of what happens on the nuclear negotiations.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And if I may add a footnote to what Ambassador Bloomfield said, Ben, obviously, if the Iranian society is any indication, Iran is like a powder cake. Just the past few days, the oil workers across Iran have gone on a strike, and the regime is very fearful of another uprising like the one we witnessed in 2019. And clearly, I think even now, the prospects for an uprising is much closer than before. And just as the world was surprised when we saw what happened in November 2019, I think the world is also in for a big surprise when the next uprising comes, about which, ironically, the former president of this regime, the firebrand Ahmadinejad, has warned, said that I keep telling you that a flood is coming, and when it comes, it will sweep all of us away. We now go to the second question, third question.
Could I just intervene, sorry,
please,
with
Mr.
a
Robertson,
footnote
please.
To the last question. There is a new tool for human rights that has in December last year been approved by the European Union, 27 countries, and by Britain a few months before. It's called Magnitsky sanctions. It's named after a Russian who was beaten up and killed in a Moscow prison. But it names, blames, and shames individuals who are guilty of human rights abuse. And I do think that on the sanctions list, it stops them obviously from entering democratic countries, and it grasps their funds, that might be important, and stops their relatives from entering for medical or study reasons. I think we should add to that, not just Raisi, but all the others who were complicit in the death committee's mass murder of innocent prisoners. I think that is something that could be achieved quite quickly and isn't perfectly a development that arises logically from these changes in British and European laws.
Thank you very much for that very important input, Mr. Robertson. The next question is from, I will read it for you, from Ali Rajab, who's a reporter with Sky News Arabia. The question is, the United States, how will the United States deal with Raisi as someone whose name is in the sanctions list and is a violator of human rights? Can one say that the ascension of Raisi as presidency will mark a turning point in relations with this regime or not?
هل ممكن نطرح سؤال؟
Perhaps I can just make a quick
Please,
response.
Ambassador.
My observation of the Biden administration is that human rights are a central focus of President Biden's message to the world that America is back and seeking to uphold the rules-based international order. If you look at what they have said about genocide in Xinjiang, China, against the Uyghurs, if you look at what they've said about the coup d'etat and the treatment of Rohingya in Burma, about what has happened in Hong Kong, about the fate of Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison, even though, of course, Biden met with President Putin in Geneva, you will see that, and the Sanctions Act, the Caesar Sanctions Act, which Congress has passed against Syria, there is quite a bit of momentum backed by action that places the US government in the position of being a defender of principles of human rights. This will have to necessarily affect the willingness and the ability of interactions between the US and Iran. We don't know, well, maybe we know already who Raisi's foreign minister will be. I believe that we now have a more honest view. Mr. Mohammed Javad Zarif was a charming man who made friends with many Western diplomats, and behind the screen of his warm smile, there were terrible deceptions and acts of hostility happening against the West by the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Intelligence, the Revolutionary Guards, and other major pillars of the Iranian state. So I think the Biden administration has to be very careful and will have to make a symbolic move to limit the level of engagement and also the agenda, which will be transactional at most and not related to any possibility of warming relations.
Thank you very much for that, Ambassador. The next question is from Al-Hura. The question is, how can one prosecute the president of a regime which signs agreements with the Western countries, including, of course, the negotiations over the nuclear agreement in Vienna? How can you prosecute a president of a country like that? We, of course, ourselves believe that crime against humanity cannot go unpunished. And we have said all along that no amount of political and economic concessions can moderate the behavior of this regime. When we see that crime against humanity is involved, I think international communities should take it seriously, and nothing must prevent the international community from bringing those who have perpetrated crimes against humanity to justice, regardless of whether it is the nuclear deal or whatever agreement. I think crime against humanity stands out as a punishable crime, and we do not believe that the Western countries can use the justification, as they did during the Obama administration, that they want to put Iran into the nuclear box to basically turn their blind eye to other egregious behavior of this regime, and that includes crime against humanity. If there's any other question, please ask your questions, because we also want to continue with our two other panelists who, of course, have a lot to contribute to the discussion today.
Mr. Safavi, can I just say quickly in response to that question,
Please.
that obviously it's quite right, and Jeffrey Robertson clearly says that the law isn't always the solution. But remember, there's a great deal of publicity to be had from these things. And even where the law cannot be brought to bear directly upon a regime, which is entirely protected within its own hard shell, the publicity associated with dealing with these sorts of issues can make a difference.
Yes, no, you're absolutely correct. And it's precisely why in July, this huge international conference, 3-day conference, is being held. And I'm sure that it will draw a lot of attention to this issue and other crimes that this regime is committed.
But the question is a good one. I'm sorry if I can add a word.
Please,
because I was involved in dealing with Charles Taylor, who claimed immunity because he was head of state when the crimes were committed. He was head of Liberia, and this also rose in the Pinochet case. How can you prosecute a head of state who signs agreements and so on? They have a special form of immunity. The argument is that a crime against humanity and the need to end impunity by punishing it trumps any immunity. That is the case in an ex-head of state like Pinochet and Taylor. Whether it's the case in a sitting head of state has yet to be authoritatively decided.
Thank you very much. Of course, I'm sure that yourself and other international jurists can think I think, about how to proceed and make
but
it happen.
It's theoretical until he leaves Iran and brings himself within the jurisdiction of another country, which he's unlikely to do.
Yes, we'll see. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Reza Fallahi, who was a former political prisoner. And Mr. Fallahi, my apologies for keeping you waiting. There was a great deal of interest on the part of journalists to ask the questions. Please go ahead. The floor is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, everybody. I thought that Mr. Tahir is in front of me, but anyway, okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for giving the chance to share my own story about the 1988 summer massacre. I am Reza Fallahi. I arrested in September 1981 for the supporting of the Mujahedin-e-Khalq organization, and was released 10 years later in September 1991. I reside in the UK now. I am among the survivors of the 1988 massacre, in which 30,000 political prisoners were executed. None of them had been sentenced to death before. The planning for the massacre began at least a year before the actual execution took place. Prison officials took the unusual steps in early 1987 and late 1988 late 1987 and early 1988 of again and reinterrogating, categorizing and separating the political prisoners along their party affiliation and length of their sentences. For example, in the second half of December 1987, a prison official, Mr. Dawood Lashkari, asked each of the prisoners a series of questions, and based on our answers, we were classified as white, yellow, and red. Mohammed Moghise, which is usually known as Mr. Naserian, who was the supervisor of the Gohardash prison in Karaj, asked all prisoners to fill out detailed questionnaires, after while they transfer some of the prisoners from Gohardash to Evin prison. Personally, I remember immediately after the acceptance of the Security Council resolution by the Iranian regime, a judicial official said in a press conference that the case of all prisoners will be reviewed very soon. Later, prison gates were closed, scheduled fortnightly family visits and telephone calls were canceled. And then after end of the massacre, we found that even our families were forbidden to gather outside the prison gates to question about what was going on and suspicious changes on regular family visit and so on. They even summoned a number of prisoners who leave had already been agreed upon due to medical problems. The actual execution process began in the early hours of Sunday, 30th of July, 1988, by calling some of the prisoners that they were in their red category. None of them came back to the ward. Some were our cellmates. I was summoned to the death commission, which was comprised of 4 members: Hossein Ali Nayeri, the Sharia judge; Morteza Eshraqi, the prosecutor; Mustafa Pur Mohammadi, the representative of the Intelligence Ministry; and Ebrahim Raisi, the acting prosecutor, who displayed particular hostility toward me and other cellmates. At that time, I didn't know Raisi, but one of my cellmates who had been sentenced in Karaj told me that the man was Ebrahim Raisi. So I connected his face to this name. In this committee, ask me some question. I don't know. I try to be very fast. My name, surname, father's name, family address, job before arresting, and date of birth, and so. Incorporation, in which political organization were you arrested? Have you ever been pardoned? Are you willing to apply for amnesty or pardons? What do you think about your organization? Do you believe in the organization still? Do you believe in the regime of the Islamic Republic? Are you willing to condemn your political organization? Are you willing to write and willing to repent? On that day, some 20 prisoners were called in the room one by one. Afterwards, they were taken out of the ward and taken to the main hall at the end of the corridor. An hour later, the guards returned with their belongings. We never saw them again. Overall, only 12 people survived in our ward, but they put, for example, Nasser Mansouri on a stretcher while he was paralyzed because of a spinal amputation. They were hanging him in this way. Even to the mentally ill prisoners, such as my cellmate Abbas Afghan and Masoud Rashian, had no mercy either. Those who had been serious mental health problem and whose medical records testified to their abnormal condition. Masoud remembered nothing of his past. Zafar Afshari, who was sentenced to death himself, either had to carry Kaveh Nasseri on his shoulder while he was suffering from a severe attack of epilepsy. They intended to torture the prisoner even at the last minute. As a former political prisoner, I am concerned about the recurrence of the event of the summer of 1918. To stop the regime from committing another massacre, the International Committee, in particular the United Nations, must end the culture of impunity and launch an independent investigation into the massacre and bring people like Raisi to account. Raisi became the president due to his unquestioning obedience to Khamenei and his penchant to murder with impunity and suppress the dissidents. I would like to take the opportunity to announce that I am one of the individuals who filed a complaint against Raisi in the United Kingdom. I can assure you we will continue to legal endeavor until we bring him to justice. The International Committee must promise the Iranian people that they stand with the Iranian people in support of their basic aspiration, and that the world today is not a safe place for the murderers of political prisoners and the suffering people. The international community is facing a great test today, and the Iranian people are anxiously waiting to see what the international committee will do, a savage and inhuman killer. Will Western countries and the United Nations remain silent like they did during the 1988 massacre? Or this time the criminals will be dealt decisively and will make to pay for their crime against humanity? If I have time, I would like to remind you of the quote from my one of the prison authorities 1 year prior to the 1988 massacre. After beating us, torture, and finally a high-ranked person come and ask us to take our blindfold, and he told us a very important message that I think it was not only from himself, but it was from the regime side. He told us, don't be deceived by the Western countries and so-called human rights. It's him message. They don't exchange all your red blood with a barrel of black oil. We never believed this, and we thought that as a joke until 1988, while the reality happened. I wrote this story in detail as the only truth that I have heard from the tongue of a regime authority. And thank you for giving me this time to be with you and hear my story. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fallahi. Your story, of course, was shocking to everyone who hears it. But we also share your hope and belief, and we will work as you are doing to make sure that these criminals are brought to justice. At this time, I will ask our distinguished panelist, Mr. Tahir Boumedra, a great friend of the Iranian resistance. Please begin your remarks, Mr. Boumedra. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Ali.
Thank you.
In fact, most of the issues I wanted to raise have been more or less touched upon. But I still want to clarify certain issues. First, regarding Khomeiни's fatwa. The fatwa is still actually in force. It has never been repealed or abrogated. So Raisi will certainly use it in the future. And he already used it while he is the head of the judiciary system. So the fatwa in 1988, the summer of 1988, was targeting mainly the MEK members and sympathizers. The Mujahedin have paid a very, very heavy price for that. And the Mujahedin brought this issue right on time to the United Nations, but somehow the United Nations has put aside this issue, and it's been forgotten for some years. But 30 years later, on the 5th of March, 2018, the late Special Rapporteur, Asma Jahangir, she reintroduced this matter on the Special Rapporteur's agenda. And thanks to her, her predecessors have been working on the issue till the 3rd of September 2020. 7 Special Rapporteurs wrote to the government of Iran, warning them that if they don't take a serious investigation, independent investigation, they will call on an international investigation and the establishment of an international commission for that purpose. Obviously, this has been taken seriously by the United Nations human rights mechanism, and it's been reflected in the report of the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations, as well as the Secretary General to the General Assembly of the United Nations. The Secretary General reported in paragraph 19 of his report to the General Assembly, states that under the heading of impediment to accountability, he stated that available information suggests that measures taken by state, meaning the Iranian state authorities, to prevent human rights violations or for the effective remedy are largely inexistent in the Iranian system. He continues saying, impunity exists in present and past cases. This is the report of the Secretary General of the United Nations saying it. Impunity exists in present and past cases of violations that have not been investigated or prosecuted. The climate of impunity is compounded by a lack of due process, threat of reprisals, and pressure against human rights defenders. This is the report of the Secretary General to the General Assembly. Clearly, this report make it very difficult to the human rights mechanism, the United Nations human rights mechanism, to ignore or to keep calling on the Iranian regime to investigate itself. So from now on, states and human rights mechanism of the United Nations will have to stop calling on Iran to investigate, and will have to start thinking about setting up an independent international commission of investigation. In all this, what is the situation of Ebrahim Raisi? Ebrahim Raisi, as you all know, he evolved, his career evolved within the Iranian judicial system. From 1988, he was involved. He has played a key role in the 1988 massacre of political prisoners. He was the Deputy Prosecutor General of Tehran in 1988 and member of the Death Commission, which paved the way for the extrajudicial executions of more than 30,000 political prisoners. Recently, or rather the last elections in 2016, Hassan Rouhani confronted Ebrahim Raisi during the campaign. And Hassan Rouhani, addressing Ebrahim Raisi, he told him, "You know nothing in running the institution of the state. All you know is how to torture and execute." This is Rouhani's statement in the face of Ebrahim Raisi. But Ebrahim Raisi now, during the current or recent campaign, he directly or indirectly admitted his role in the mass executions, because he was praising himself, saying that as a judge or prosecutor, he has to defend the rights of people and the security of the society. He must be lauded and encouraged for doing so. So this is a way of justifying his involvement in the 1988 massacre. In this situation, JVMI is joining its voice to Amnesty International. And we are calling for Ebrahim Raisi to be investigated for his involvement in past and the ongoing crimes under international law, and call on states that exercise universal jurisdiction to bring him to justice. In fact, on behalf of the families of the victims, and I join my voice to what Mr. Reza Falahi has said, that there is a possibility, and we are going to do it, the possibility of addressing the British system through the Scotland Yard in order to lodge a complaint against Raisi. Now, I heard the argument that the head of state might claim immunity, and that most states don't accept or don't practice universal jurisdictions when it comes to heads of states because of this immunity. But we are not going to wait till immunity is declared or refused for Raisi to act. We are going to act, and we are going to put the situation towards the British system. Now, they accept it or they don't accept it, that's another matter. It will be discussed among lawyers and among the British authorities concerned. But as far as JVM is concerned, I have in front of me the procedures to be followed. There is a possibility. Yes, it's difficult when it concerns the head of states, but those who are not heads of states, the British system does allow extraterritorial jurisdiction. And in this context of extraterritorial jurisdiction, we will approach the British authorities concerned, and we will put to them this file. Now, when it comes to Raisi, it's this kind of complaint, it will make his life difficult in terms of he will have in the future to negotiate his immunity wherever he travels, as long as there is a file ready to put to the judges, ready by the families of the victims. The evidence is ready. First of all, there are confessions made by the persecutors themselves, and JVM has also documented a large amount of evidence that will be put to the authorities concerned. So having said that, JVMI and the families of the victims, they strongly believe that Raisi's place is not as a person with his hands full of blood of innocent people. His place is not to run a state or to be a president of a large country. His place, in fact, is in even prison. If not even prison, it should be in the ICC's detention facility in The Hague. So Raisi future will be always a matter of debate, a matter of discussion, and states will find it difficult after having 7 special rapporteurs of the United Nations testifying against him. Now we have the report of the Secretary General of the United Nations also making it clear that we cannot trust the Iranian government since they are not ready to cooperate and they are unable to prosecute themselves. So states now have no reason to delay establishing a commission of inquiry that will handle this matter. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boumedra, for your comments. And indeed, what you just said, that no one should expect the regime in Tehran and the criminal rulers of that country to prosecute themselves. The onus is, of course, on the part of the international community. And naturally, as has been stated, the National Council of Resistance and the families of the victims will do all in their power to bring Raisi and other leaders of this regime to justice for the crimes they have committed against the people of Iran over the past 42 years. If experience is any judge, or if history is any judge, we will succeed in this endeavor as we have done in our previous endeavors, however difficult and insurmountable they seemed at the beginning. But as Martin Luther King said once quite aptly, that the arc of universe bends slowly, but it will certainly bend toward justice. And I think justice will come for the criminal rulers of Iran. And again, I remind everyone that we are going to proceed with filing lawsuits against Raisi in several countries, including the United Kingdom. And also, of course, we will bring further attention to this issue and other issues related to Iran on July 10 and July 10, 11, and 12 during the Free Iran World Summit, the democratic alternative on the march to victory. And I encourage everyone to join us then. And if none of the panelists has any questions, I would like to bring our discussion, very fruitful discussion today, to a close. And I thank very much all of the panelists for their very, very important contribution to this extremely urgent and critical matter facing the world today. Well, thank you very much. And hopefully we will have another briefing on this at some point later. And goodbye for now.